The intercom buzzed, jolting me awake. My secretary, Lisa, informed me that a woman was insisting on a personal and urgent meeting. I quickly splashed some water on my face to shake off the grogginess and made my way to my private office. As I looked out at the city below, a wave of disdain washed over me. I hated the place, and the people working on the 17 floors beneath me, despite them being my employees, irritated me even more. Lisa entered my office without knocking, which was hardly surprising since I was hardly ever here anymore. I was merely a figurehead now, confined to my penthouse with nowhere else to go. A young woman walked in, exuding an air of importance but clearly uncomfortable in the grand setting. She introduced herself as Emily Turner from Social Services, trying to appear casual. Though she seemed out of her depth in this environment, Emily explained that she was dealing with a case involving 2 children and a mother who had attempted suicide. She handed me a letter that had been found beside the mother. The letter began with, "My dearest David." I recognized the handwriting immediately, and it took me back 11 years to a time when my life took a dramatic turn. I recalled that chaotic morning with striking clarity. A burst water main on Chiswick High Road had caused a massive traffic jam, making me nearly an hour and a half late. When I finally sneaked into the office, my secretary scolded me for my dead phone and told me Mark Stevens had been trying to reach me. I had no desire to meet with him since he and his brother had no idea how to handle contracts or keep clients satisfied. Mark told me there was a problem with the Smith account and that I needed to fly out immediately to smooth things over with their board, or risk losing their business. Mark was confident I could handle it, as I had done before, but inside I resented Mark and his brother James for their poor management of the company. I knew voicing my frustrations could jeopardize my job. Mark insisted I catch a noon flight because Ethan Smith had retired and his nephew, Ryan Smith, was now in charge. He dismissed my plans with Laura for the theater, prioritizing the Smith account over my personal life. Despite my protests about needing to pack and my commitment to Laura, Mark insisted that understanding the importance of the Smith account, which accounted for nearly half of our revenue, was crucial. He even suggested I call Laura to pack my things, as there wasn't enough time for me to go home before the flight. As I left Mark's office, I reflected on how I had started working for Michael Carter right out of college when the company was still small. Michael had weathered tough times under Alice Bennett's policies, saving the company while others went under. He had seized the opportunity to capitalize on surplus machinery by fixing and selling it at high prices to developing countries. A classic Tory, he likely kept profits offshore to dodge taxes. As bankruptcies decreased, Michael shifted focus to becoming a middleman for companies selling machine tools in Europe, assembling and delivering machines within the EEC. The company thrived until Michael's 2 sons, Mark and James, joined. Despite their university education, their just-in-time approach led to delays because they failed to anticipate unexpected issues in our line of work. Their insistence on tight schedules often resulted in late deliveries and dissatisfied clients. Mark was adamant that I fly to New York to fix the issue with the Smith job, even though it was their responsibility. He knew full well that if things went wrong, I'd be the one to take the blame. Despite this, I went along with his demands. I called Laura at the factory to inform her of the situation. Laura also worked for Stevens & Sons, and I knew that if things fell apart, we'd both be in hot water. Laura and I had met years ago when she joined the typing pool, and we got married just 4 months later. We had enjoyed 10 happy years together. Life at home was great, but work had become a hassle after Michael's sons took over and disrupted the company's dynamics. Before they arrived, I had been Michael's right-hand man, helping him with everything. His sons resented my influence and, although they were polite, it was clear they didn't like how much sway I had with their father. Michael Carter had taken the company public and made a lot of money, but he never gave me any shares or a directorial position. When Michael had a heart attack, he asked me to oversee his sons, but without shares, my influence was limited. Michael retired and passed away 3 months later, and his sons made a series of unwelcome changes. They moved the office to Chiswick and appointed James as the factory manager, with Laura as his secretary, that I didn't like Laura working for James. I suspected jealousy or mistrust from the Stevens brothers. Laura got along well with James and often defended him, which created tension between us. My frequent work travels only added to the friction. Laura was upset, thinking I volunteered for this trip. She made a scene, but I tried to explain the urgency of the situation. Her frustration with my constant absences was palpable. Laura arrived late at the airport, which only added to the tension between us. She remained distant and urged me to concentrate on my work. The check-in clerk told me, "You need to check your bag in now, Mr. Turner, or it won't make it onto your flight." I hurried to finish checking in my bag and looked back, but Laura was nowhere to be seen. I asked the clerk how long before the flight was called. "Probably about half an hour," he said. "I'd stay in the departure area." I dashed in the direction Laura had gone, but she must have been moving quickly because I couldn't catch up. I spotted an entrance to a bridge leading to the short-term parking lot at the end of the concourse. As I crossed the bridge, I saw a bright yellow Lamborghini leaving the parking lot below. I could barely make out Laura's coat through the passenger side window. I knew it was James Stevens driving, even though I couldn't see him clearly. James never let anyone else drive his flashy car. That I was furious. James Stevens couldn't be bothered to go to New York, but had time to chauffeur my wife around in his fancy car. Fuming, I returned to the terminal and went to the bar, a rare choice for me, and ordered a drink. After stewing there for about 20 minutes, my flight was called, and I headed to the departure lounge. On the flight, I pored over the contracts, searching for the usual loopholes that Michael had included to give us some flexibility with delivery dates. However, the latest contracts had been handled by the Stevens brothers, and most of those helpful loopholes were gone. When I landed at JFK, Ryan Smith was there to meet me, along with Sophia, his PA, and a group of sycophants. I had met Ryan a few times before. Despite being only about 5 years older than me, he always seemed much younger. Typically, Ethan Smith handled most of the talking, while Ryan just nodded along and laughed at his jokes. However, Ryan's overly enthusiastic welcome, combined with his entourage of helpers who carried my bags to the waiting limo, made me suspicious. "We've booked you into the company suite at the Waldorf Astoria," Ryan informed me. He mentioned that Ethan had hoped to meet me on this trip but was still on his world cruise. Ethan asked Ryan to let me know he'd visit once his ship docked in Southampton. I found it peculiar that Ethan Smith wanted to see me. Sure, I had always had a good working relationship with him, and I'd interacted with him several times over the years, but it was always on a professional level. Now that he was retired, why the sudden interest in meeting me? Michael Carter always stayed at the Waldorf Astoria when he was in New York. Personally, I preferred less flashy accommodations, but Ryan insisted the suite was the company's. I figured it was just available, though I couldn't picture the Stevens brothers shelling out for a suite just for me. After dropping me off at the Waldorf, Ryan said he'd have Sophia pick me up for dinner around 7 p.m., then he and his entourage departed. The whole trip was becoming increasingly bewildering. I should have been the one inviting Ryan Smith to dinner, not the other way around. It was about 4 p.m. local time. I wondered if Laura had gone to the play alone since she had the tickets. I called home, but there was no answer. Assuming it was around 9 p.m. in London, I texted her to ask how she was enjoying the play and who she was with. When Sophia arrived to pick me up, I was still on the phone. I hadn't heard back from Laura, and there was still no answer at home. I left a message on the answering machine saying I was going out to dinner and would call her the next day. As I was about to leave, Sophia took my briefcase from me and put it back where I had left it. "This evening is just for socializing, David. Ryan wants you to meet his family," Sophia said. "He mentioned it was a shame you didn't bring your wife along." "Sophia, what's going on?" I asked once we were in the car. Sophia seemed to be choosing her words carefully before she answered. "Ryan thinks that since you two do so much business together, it would be beneficial for you to get to know each other better." He also wants you to meet everyone on the Smith board. None of this made much sense to me until I started to wonder if maybe Smith and Partners were considering offering me a job away from Stevens and Sons. That seemed like the only explanation for all the odd behavior. The dinner was excellent, attended by many members of the Smith board and their spouses. Afterward, we went to a nightclub where some people danced. I stayed out of it, feeling the effects of jet lag after being awake for several hours longer than everyone else. As the night wore on, I grew more convinced that my theory about being headhunted might be correct. All the board members made an effort to engage with me and make me feel at ease. Sophia stayed close, almost acting like my personal assistant. Whenever someone approached me, she would quietly provide their name and any pertinent details. Around 2 a.m. in New York, which was 7 a.m. back home, I made my way back to my room. There were no messages on my phone, and the hotel reception confirmed that Laura hadn't left any either. Although I considered calling her, I decided against it since it was early, and she had been out late the night before that. I was abruptly awakened at 11 a.m. by Sophia, who brought breakfast and updated me on my schedule. "You've got a board meeting at noon, and afterward, there's a round of golf with Ryan. We'll be taking a helicopter to SJ's estate right after that," she said briskly. "Ryan's also curious if you're in a rush to get back to London." I replied that it depended on what Ryan and the board decided regarding our delays. "I'm sure they'll agree with whatever I propose. They trust my judgment. But don't waste any time. You don't want to be late." Sophia seemed flustered and hurried off. I tried reaching Laura, but she wasn't at her office. The temp receptionist didn't recognize my voice and couldn't provide any details on Laura's whereabouts. On a whim, I asked to speak with James Stevens, but he was unavailable as well. Frustrated, I called home, but there was no answer. Both Laura's and James's phones were turned off. Annoyed, I dialed Mark Stevens at the Chiswick office, pretending I needed clarification on a contract. Mark's response was sluggish. "Oh, I think James is in Brighton today with the Carter's Industries directors." He took Laura along to take notes. You know how Mark's memory can be, I thought to myself, you deceitful fool. That contract was wrapped up last week. It's already complete. What are you trying to pull? I didn't say it out loud, but the frustration was palpable. Mark then asked how things were progressing, and I told him I might need a few extra days to sort everything out. As soon as I ended the call, I reached out to Lucas Carter's secretary in Brighton. Just as I suspected, she confirmed that no meetings with James were scheduled for that day and that she had no recollection of him meeting anyone. When Sophia returned, she urged me to get ready for the conference. I quickly finished my breakfast and jumped into the shower. We arrived fashionably late, but it seemed no one took notice. The day began with introductions and a tour of the offices, and we didn't actually get into the conference room until nearly 1 p.m. The negotiations felt almost absurd. It was as if everyone was more concerned about my feelings than the actual business at hand. They all agreed with everything I said and seemed to share my frustrations with the Stevens brothers, though no one explicitly stated it. I assumed they were gearing up to make me a lucrative offer, but I was taken aback when nothing materialized. After the meeting, Ryan, a few other directors, and I headed up to the roof to catch the helicopter. Sophia, as usual, was by my side. She asked when I planned to return to England and arranged a flight for later that day. On the golf course, I used my mobile to call my secretary in Chiswick and informed her I'd be staying a few more days, making sure everyone thought I was still abroad. Sophia, overhearing my conversation, noticed my unease. Concerned, she asked if something was wrong. I hinted at some potential personal issues back home and my suspicions. Sophia assured me of her discretion and offered to help keep my return a secret so I could catch anyone involved in my suspicions if they were true. Sophia grasped the urgency of my situation and assured me she would manage any calls from England, making sure no one knew about my late-night flight home. She guaranteed that aside from Ryan, she was the only person aware of my return and would stall anyone trying to reach me. As Sophia and I spoke, I noticed Ryan approaching. Sophia subtly signaled him, and he veered away to converse with others, giving me the privacy I needed for my calls. after the game, we headed to SJ's mansion for dinner. I saw SJ's daughter, Charlotte, again, and something felt off. Despite knowing Charlotte for years, she seemed unusually uneasy around me that evening. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt like there was something they were hiding from me. I began to worry that confiding in Sophia about my suspicions might have been a mistake. Later that day, we flew back to the company headquarters by helicopter, and then Sophia drove me to the airport. She had arranged for someone to collect my belongings from the Waldorf Astoria. The flight back to Heathrow was uneventful, but upon landing, a steward met me at arrivals and directed me to a service phone for an urgent call. "David, it's Sophia. We had everyone waiting on the phone for you last night after you left. Your wife called, and I told her you were in a meeting with Ryan." Both Smiths called separately, and I gave them the same message. Your wife called again, asking when you'd be home. I told her you were on the Saturday evening flight. Is that all right? Thanks, Sophia. That should work. I'll call them from my mobile later and confirm, I replied. I appreciate your help. Stay in touch if anyone else calls. It seemed Laura was unusually concerned about my whereabouts. I wondered why she was so interested all of a sudden. I booked a room at the Novotel near the airport and discovered that Hertz had already delivered the car I had arranged from New York. The car, reserved under my name, was a straightforward option due to the company's account with Hertz. Feeling awake and restless, I decided to drive by my house. Laura's car was in the driveway, and the house was dark, understandable at just after 4 a.m. I called the house phone from the call box at the end of our street, but it went to voicemail. I dialed 4 times with no response, leading me to assume Laura wasn't home. I left the car where it was and walked to the house. After quietly entering and checking, I confirmed it was empty. I decided to wait for Laura to return. I made a pot of coffee and settled into the lounge, hoping the caffeine would keep me alert. Instead, I was roused just before 8 a.m. by the loud rumble of a Lamborghini. From the window, I saw Laura and James get out of the bright yellow car and approach the house. Come in, Bobby. I'll be quick with my shower and getting dressed. Head into the kitchen and make some coffee, will you? I need something to clear my head, Laura called out. It was peculiar that neither of them noticed me sitting in the lounge, even though the door was wide open. It seems some people just don't see what they're not expecting. Laura dashed upstairs while James went into the kitchen. I heard him rummaging through the cupboards before asking, "Where's your coffee maker?" "It's on the counter," Laura called back from upstairs. "I can't find it," James grumbled. Just then, Laura came downstairs, exclaiming, "You men are useless without a good woman around to help you." As she walked into the kitchen, her voice trailed off. "That's odd, it should be on the counter." "I don't think I left it." "Oh my God, what are you doing here?" Laura's eyes widened as she spotted me. She was clad in nothing but a skimpy bra and thong, an outfit I hadn't seen before. "I'm just sitting here, waiting for my so-called faithful wife to return," I said, rising from my chair. My anger boiled over. "Now I think I'm going to smash that slimy jerk's face in." Both Laura and James were stunned, momentarily paralyzed as if they'd expected me to still be in the U.S. James, snapping out of his shock, tried to flee. Unfortunately for him, our front door had a complex night latch with a tricky lever. The more he yanked and pulled, the more frantic he became. I threw him against the door and gave him a thorough beating. It seemed he didn't even know how to defend himself. Laura, in a frantic bid to save James, screamed that it wasn't what it looked like and tried to pull me off him. I didn't hit James as much as I wanted to. I'm not naturally violent, and when he tried to curl up on the floor, I stopped. I know some might have kicked him while he was down, but I couldn't bring myself to do that. Turning the latch the right way, I flung open the door and pushed James outside, almost instinctively. I grabbed Laura and shoved her out as well. I slammed the door shut and headed straight for the lounge, where I made a beeline for the liquor cabinet. Laura pounded on the door and rang the doorbell for a while. From the window, I saw James get back into his Lamborghini and return with a travel blanket, likely to cover Laura, who was barely dressed. Laura began yelling through the mail slot, insisting it wasn't what it seemed and begging to be let back in. I refused to engage, ignoring her pleas. As some neighbors began to watch from their doors and yards, Laura switched to banging on one of the lounge windows. Her desperation led her to hit the window too hard, causing it to shatter. She cut her arm badly on the broken glass. Moments later, paramedics and an ambulance arrived, presumably called by the police. An officer knocked on the door, spoke briefly with Laura and James, and then approached me. I explained that I had found my wife with another man in my house. The officer noted that James claimed I had hit him, which I confirmed, adding that I had only shown Laura the door. Another officer, who had been talking to Laura and James, indicated that neither wished to press charges and that there was no serious violence involved. However, Laura's arm required stitches, and she needed clothes for the hospital. I refused to provide any, suggesting that her boyfriend could buy her some. As the Lamborghini followed the ambulance away, I mentioned that I needed to call the window repair service and my lawyer. The officers left, hoping not to return. My lawyer connected me with a colleague who specializes in divorces. She said she could start the process, but there wasn't much she could do until we knew who Laura would be hiring as her lawyer. It all hinged on how Laura chose to handle things. Throughout the morning, I noticed police cars driving by repeatedly. While I was moving Laura's clothes, packed into trash bags, into the garage, it struck me that there might be some arrangement between the police and Laura. They must have informed her that I'd placed her belongings in the garage. Around 4 in the afternoon, a different police car arrived. This time, it was just one officer who remained in the vehicle. Shortly after, a Ford Transit van, driven by one of the factory employees, backed into my driveway. I used the remote to open the garage door and watched as Laura, her arm in a sling, stepped out of the passenger seat with a woman from her office. Together, they loaded her things into the van. Laura tried to open the service door between the garage and the kitchen but found it locked. She came around to the front and rang the doorbell. "David, we need to talk. You've got it all wrong. Nothing happened between James and me. David, I know you're in there. Please, let's talk. You're making a huge mistake," she pleaded through the mail slot. I opened the door just enough to shove her handbag into her hand, then slammed it shut. I had already removed her credit cards and house keys. I watched as Laura spoke to the police officer who had exited his car. He shrugged and shook his head, then pointed to a spot on the ground, probably indicating where Laura and her friends should wait. He then came up and knocked on the door. "Your wife wants to talk to you, sir." "You can't keep her out of the house," he said as I opened the door. "There's nothing to discuss," I replied. "The house is on the market because she decided it's no longer our home. If it were, she would have been here last night instead of with her boyfriend. Tell her to have her lawyer contact mine. She knows who they are." The officer returned to the driveway and had a brief, animated conversation with Laura and her friends. Laura seemed to collapse into her friend's arms, and they helped her back into the van. They drove off, and the officer watched as the garage door slowly closed. He shrugged at a neighbor who had been watching, then got back in his car and left. About an hour later, Sophia called. I filled her in on everything that had happened. She expressed her sympathy and asked what I planned to do next. I told her I was going to divorce Laura and that I couldn't continue working for Stevens. Sophia insisted that I stay in touch and made me promise to do so. She also mentioned that Ethan Smith would be reaching out to me and that I should keep in touch with him. Ryan had already mentioned this, and I wondered why Ethan Smith's visit was so crucial that I didn't get back to the Novotel until midnight. I couldn't bear to stay in the house again. It held too many painful memories. After breakfast the next morning, I called my secretary to ask if Mark was in the office. She told me he wasn't coming in that day and asked what was going on. I laid everything out for her, and she was clearly upset. Her voice wavered, and I could hear the tears in her words. She mentioned that Mark had hinted I might resign when I returned, and she thought he was avoiding the office to steer clear of my presence. Mark's absence struck me as odd. I would have expected him to relish the chance to fire me, especially after our clash. Mark's brother, James, was one of the company's directors, and there had always been tension between us. Nothing about the situation added up. My trip to New York was a mess of confusion. Mark had insisted I go, but when I arrived, everyone at Smith seemed shocked to see me. There were some late deliveries, but the overall response was oddly subdued. Then there was James pursuing Laura. It was strange. James usually went for younger women, and Laura was at least 5 years older than him. While it was possible they could have developed feelings for each other, I had serious doubts about James falling for someone outside his usual type. I decided to go to the office to collect my personal belongings. While I was there, I wiped the hard drives on both my company computer and my laptop, but not before backing up everything onto zip drives. I delivered my resignation letter, which my secretary had prepared, directly to the personnel officer. He arranged for my final salary and bonuses to be deposited into my account immediately. Initially, the accounts department was reluctant, but they changed their attitude once they realized who was resigning. Almost everyone in the office either helped me move my things to the rental car or came out to say goodbye. I had left my company car securely locked in the garage at the house. I wanted to ensure I received everything I was owed before returning it. I stayed at the Novotel for about a week while searching for a new flat. The house sold quickly due to its prime location and my competitive pricing. For work, I decided to take a few months off to consider my next steps. I was still hoping Smiths might make me an offer, so I didn't want to commit to anything too soon. As for Laura, our encounters were intense and ended in heated arguments. I called her a cheating little expletive, which only fueled her anger. I was surprised she didn't move in with James immediately. She didn't move in with him until several months after I kicked her out. I'm not sure where she stayed in the meantime, but my investigator reported she moved in with James right after our first major argument at the lawyer's office. The second big argument occurred when we signed the divorce papers. Laura, dressed in an oversized winter coat, looked out of place and uneasy. As my lawyer and I sat across from her, the settlement details were read. After Laura signed the papers, they were placed in front of me. Just as I was about to sign, Laura asked, "David, are you really sure you want to do this?" "There are some things you need to," I interrupted her, asking my lawyer, "Did I just hear a cheating, lying little expletive say something?" Laura erupted into a furious rage, hurling insults at me. I quickly signed the papers and left the room without another word. As I've said before, I wasn't keen on getting into a shouting match with Laura. Weeks after the divorce was finalized, Sophia reached out to let me know that Ethan Smith would be in Southampton that weekend. I made arrangements to meet him at a local hotel. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan had an agenda. Though he was just a long-time client, he was unusually warm and friendly. We exchanged condolences about Michael's passing, and Ethan expressed regret over the fallout between Laura and me. He claimed he was sorry he hadn't intervened earlier but had to respect Michael's wishes. I sensed he was dodging the real issue. Things took a turn when Charlotte walked into the room. She greeted me with a hug and a kiss on the cheek before handing Ethan a briefcase. After that, she and Ethan's wife left. Ethan wasted no time getting down to business. "All right, David," Ethan said, leaning in. "What was your reaction when Michael floated the company and didn't give you any shares?" I was caught off guard. "Well, it was his company, and he had every right to do with it as he pleased," I said. "But you were instrumental in building it. I'd assume you went above and beyond for him." Ethan didn't seem interested in small talk. "Did you know Michael owned a significant portion of Smith's through offshore holding companies? These same companies also control a major chunk of Stevens's shares." This was news to me, and I stayed quiet, letting Ethan continue. "Michael's retirement was strategic," Ethan explained. "He knew his time was limited and asked me to try to keep his sons in check. But since I wasn't on the board, my hands were tied. Michael had a plan. He expected his sons to run the company into the ground within a year and wanted to make sure you weren't tarnished by it. He was concerned they might try to pin the blame on you. Ethan's words hit hard. If a company collapses due to mismanagement, directors can be barred from holding future positions, correct? Michael anticipated the boys would deplete the company's resources quickly. These documents, he said, sliding a stack of papers across the table, make you the primary shareholder of those holding companies. They now belong to you, he continued, and here are the details of Michael's offshore accounts. I was supposed to keep these until Stevens and Sons failed, but considering how the brothers treated you, I think you should have them now. I was reeling. According to Michael's will, the brothers couldn't legally fire you. I suspect they set up the whole situation with Laura to force your resignation. Ethan paused, looking directly at me. You're now a very wealthy man, though your assets are tied up in offshore accounts. You'll need to figure out how to bring them back into the country legally. I can assist with that. I have access to some skilled accountants. My mind was in a whirl. Ethan had just disclosed that James Stevens had manipulated Laura and engineered the entire scandal to push me out of the company. But why the anger? Ethan asked, his voice calm yet tinged with a hint of frustration. I understand why you're upset. Michael never really believed the boys were his. Martha had a reputation for infidelity while he was away. He even had DNA tests done years ago. At one point, he wondered if he might be their father, even if not biologically, but he came to realize they knew the truth and spoke poorly of him behind his back. Ethan paused, letting his words sink in. Michael always said you were more like a son to him. That's why he chose you to inherit his fortune. He anticipated the boys would ruin the firm. I assume you'd like to see them bankrupt and broken, just as Michael intended. But what about the employees at Stevens's? They'll lose their jobs. Ethan's expression hardened. Not if a major American company takes over. Here's Michael's plan. Smith's will cancel its contracts with Stevens's within the next week. After that, some offshore shareholders will sell off a chunk of Stevens's shares on the London Stock Exchange. This will drive the stock price down. The right bank officials will then be alerted and will call in the company's loans. A group will swoop in to buy the remains of the company from the banks. Guess who will lead that group and become the main shareholder? The key is, no one will know your connection to it. He leaned in closer. You'll renegotiate the contracts with Smith's, and eventually, you might even invite me onto your board. A merger between Smith's and Stevens's could also put you on Smith's board. How does that sound? I was puzzled. Why didn't Michael just leave the company to me from the start? Ethan sighed. Michael knew you'd face legal challenges to the will for years. You were with him almost every day during his final years, and you know he was a bit eccentric. He feared the family would accuse you of having too much influence over him. They suspected he had hidden money abroad and spent a fortune trying to find it. That's why Michael left everything to me. Anyone investigating the source of your money will see it comes from me. And since I'm no longer with Smith's, we can't be accused of insider trading. Plus, I've been on that ship for the past 6 months, so my hands are clean. Ethan straightened up. Here's where things stand now. I'm now the joint chairman of Ethan Smith Associates. I've left Ryan in charge of the American branch while I oversee operations in Europe. The Stevens brothers went bankrupt and are barred from being company directors for a decade. They've tried to get back into business, but I've had people keeping an eye on them. Ethan's tone softened a bit. Interestingly, James ended up marrying Laura. He probably thought she might get a share of the money he suspected was coming to me. But since that money officially went to me after our divorce, he had no chance. Once they were married, I went to court to stop her alimony payments. After that, they received nothing from me. Their marriage didn't last more than a year. I honestly felt sorry for the twins Laura had with him. I assume they met in the office after I kicked her out, since my investigator said they rarely saw each other in the evenings. I doubt James ever paid child support after leaving her. Ethan's gaze was distant, almost reflective. I wondered how long James had been involved with Laura. She must have gotten pregnant soon after our separation. I saw her pushing a stroller on Slow High Road just a year after I kicked her out. The last I heard of James, he was living somewhere in southern Spain, and the authorities were investigating him. Southern Spain is close to Morocco, Ethan said, his tone matter of fact. I'm sure James was using fast boats to move around. That's why I tipped off the police. As for Mark, he's apparently driving buses around London now, not exactly a glamorous job. His wife left him when she discovered his affair. I'm sure you can guess who spilled the beans. Mark's mother, Martha, now lives with him. I feel guilty about Martha losing her income from Stevens and Sons? Not really. The real question is whether Martha felt any remorse for cheating on Michael. You reap what you sow. Last I heard, Laura was living in a council flat in Slough, probably relying on social benefits. Maybe she's doing something else on the side, but who knows? Sorry if that sounds harsh, but it's how I feel. Things picked up speed once Ryan and I got started. We made an excellent team, trained by the best, Michael Carter for me and Ethan Smith for Ryan. Over the next few years, we acquired numerous companies, merging them into a large multinational corporation. Now Ryan and I have stepped back, letting our teams handle most of the work. Ethan Smith and his wife settled in England, buying an estate right next to mine. His daughter Bea and I spend time together, but we're not planning on marriage. We're both experienced enough to know that's not the path for us. Bea is on the board with Ryan, Sophia, and me. We all get along well. As for Sophia, she married Ryan after his first wife died in a car accident years ago. Ryan says Sophia only married him because she was tired of waiting for me to make a move. You might wonder why I'm living alone in this penthouse. There's a void in my life since, well, you know. I go through each day, and if a good investment opportunity comes up, I take it. But there has to be more to life than just making money. A social worker just handed me a letter from Laura. I scanned it quickly and then used the intercom on my desk. Lisa, can you find out if Charlotte is in the building and ask her to come up here as soon as possible? Yes, sir. I think she's in her office. I saw her earlier and haven't seen her leave. Charlotte arrived at my office a few minutes later. I handed her the letter without saying a word. As she read it, her breathing became labored, showing her distress. That nasty, spiteful little, Charlotte began, her voice trailing off. Did you know about this? Not at all, I replied. What are you going to do? I don't have a choice here, Charlotte, I said. Turning to Emily Turner, I asked, which hospital is Laura in? Slough General. They didn't have much information when I visited last night. She had taken a mix of pills, pretty much everything she had at home. They managed to pump her stomach but aren't sure how long she was unconscious. The doctor said it would be a while before they know more. As for the kids, I placed them with an emergency foster mother last night. She'll take care of them today. I wanted to check with you about what you want to do. I need to retrieve that note. If Laura doesn't survive, the coroner will need to see it, I said. That's fine. Make a copy for me, Charlotte, and give the original back to Miss Turner. Lisa, get me the general manager of Slough Hospital right away. I used the intercom again, my mind racing with the implications of the letter and what lay ahead. The phone rang shortly after. I picked it up. Hello, yes, this is David Crawford. I have a question for you. How much is your hospital over budget this year? There was a brief pause before the response came. All right, here's the situation. You have a patient named Laura Crawford who's in for an overdose. If she survives, I'll send your hospital a check for $1 million. If she doesn't, you get nothing. Got it? Good. I expect no shortcuts and no expenses spared. Goodbye. Charlotte looked at me, concerned. Surely they're doing everything they can, she said. I don't trust the bureaucrats running our hospitals these days, I replied. They often try to cut costs. Offering $1 million should ensure they give Laura the best care possible. All right, now let's pick up the kids. I assume that's why you're here, Emily. Well, Mrs. Crawford mentioned in her letter that the children are yours. I don't see any harm in transferring their care to you for now, Emily Turner said. But until a judge decides otherwise, they're still my responsibility. Don't worry, I said. They'll be well taken care of. I'll keep you updated on their status. With your permission, we'll take them to my house near Swindon. There will be plenty for them to do until we know more about Laura. We can easily drive up the motorway in an hour to visit her. I'm glad you're thinking that way, Mr. Crawford, Emily said. Let's keep things as familiar as possible for the kids. They'll feel more comfortable if we maintain some continuity. The three of us headed to the basement parking garage. Miss Turner joined Charlotte and me in the back of my limo for the drive to Slough. Our first stop was the hospital to check on Laura. The doctors were hesitant to provide much information at this early stage. Afterwards, Emily took us to the foster home where the children were staying. Charlotte and I waited in the car while she spoke to them alone. About 10 minutes later, Emily signaled for me to come in, and Charlotte followed. Kay and Heather, this is your Uncle David, Emily introduced us. He'll take care of you until your mother is better. We decided to go with the Uncle David title until we know more about Laura's condition and how the girls will adjust to me. I said, "Hi girls," I greeted them. "This is my friend Charlotte. You can call her Auntie B." The 10-year-olds looked at us both with some suspicion. "You'll be staying with me at my country home while your mom gets better," I continued. "There are horses to ride and a swimming pool there." "Where's our mom?" Kay asked. "Can we see her?" Heather added. "Is she going to die?" "The doctors are doing everything they can to help her," I reassured them. The girls still seemed wary. "We saw her earlier, but if you want, we can visit the hospital so you can see how hard they're working to make her better," Emily noted. "They might not let the kids in to see her." "I'm sure they'll let these children in to see their mother," I replied. Just remember the situation. We dropped Emily off at the station where she had left her car, then headed to the hospital. As I expected, the rules were adjusted to allow the girls into the ICU. Surprisingly, they didn't cry as I had anticipated. The girls were surprisingly composed. Charlotte quickly noted their striking resemblance to me. I decided against conducting a DNA test, choosing instead to focus on the drive to Wiltshire, which was pleasantly uneventful. As we journeyed, the girls grew increasingly curious, marveling at the limo's amenities and the novelty of watching TV while traveling. When we exited the highway, Heather asked, "You're our dad, right?" I chose honesty. "Yes, I am. I didn't know about you until today." "If I had known earlier, you would have seen me more often," Kay added. "Mom told us last week that she never told you about us. She said she kept it from you and made you think that her other husband was our dad," Heather continued. "She said she was mean to you and didn't let you know you were our dad. Maybe someday she'll explain why she did it." "Do you think she'll get better?" Kay inquired. "I truly hope so," I said, trying to remain optimistic. Heather's response was somber. "She doesn't want to get better. She wants to go to heaven." "That's hard to believe with two amazing kids like you," Charlotte said gently. "She's just exhausted," Heather explained. "She works so hard, but there's never enough money." "Well, that won't be a problem now," I assured them. "When she's better, I'll ask her if she wants to live in that small house over there. You two will have the chance to ride horses and swim in the pool at the big house." The girls' eyes widened with wonder as they took in the grandeur of the mansion. The house staff swiftly greeted them, having prepared a cozy guest room with twin beds. Charlotte and I were momentarily sidelined as the staff efficiently took care of the girls and guided them to their new quarters. "That's unexpected," Charlotte commented. "I'm curious why Laura kept your relationship a secret." Reflecting on the situation, I said, "It's odd. Laura must have gone to great lengths to hide her pregnancy from me. Come to think of it, she might have been hiding a growing belly during our last meeting when we signed the divorce papers. She wore a long coat on a warm day, which struck me as peculiar." "It's baffling," Charlotte replied. "Why the hostility? She was the one who betrayed you. What did she think would happen when you discovered she was with someone else?" "Perhaps I'll get some answers if she survives," I said. the girls quickly adapted to their new surroundings, enjoying the care and attention from the staff. Each night, I tucked them in and told them stories about their mom and me, carefully avoiding the more painful chapters of our past. 2 weeks later, I visited Laura's hospital room. She had finally regained consciousness with a clear mind. I had left the letter she wrote clutched in her hand and had waited for her to wake up, eventually dozing off. When she spoke, her voice was faint. "Hello, David. I'm so sorry." I watched as she gazed at the letter. "How are my girls?" she asked. "They're doing great," I said. "I left them enjoying the swimming pool. They're charming and keeping the staff on their toes. Charlotte will bring them here later today." "Thank you," Laura said softly. "I regret keeping them from you. It was a foolish act of anger. Once I made that choice, I didn't know how to undo it." "Well," I said, "it's hard to imagine a worse way to handle it than what you chose." "I was desperate," Laura admitted. "I'm drowning in debt, and I can't repay it." "James left me drowning in debt," Laura said, her voice trembling. "He had me co-sign for everything. I think he married me just so he could get credit because he was bankrupt." "You don't have to worry about debts anymore," I reassured her. "I've settled everything. The lenders you owed money to are out of business for good." "Oh, you found out about them?" Laura looked surprised. "It wasn't difficult. They showed up at your apartment demanding money while one of my staff was there to gather the girls' belongings. I had them sent away and made sure they wouldn't bother you again." "Why are you being so generous?" Laura asked, a hint of confusion in her voice. "The last time we spoke, you were so hurt." "That was a long time ago," I said. "I've moved past it. It's now just a painful memory. Although reading your letter did bring back some of that pain. It'll take time for me to fully forgive you for keeping the girls from me." "I understand," Laura said softly. "I'm truly sorry." "As far as the girls are concerned," I continued, "we're friends now. If you agree, I'd like to move you to my house tomorrow. I've arranged for nurses to take care of you. Once you're fully recovered, you and the girls can live in one of the estate houses. That way, I can see them regularly." "You're not taking them away from me, are you?" Laura's voice was laced with concern. "I'm not taking their mother away from them," I assured her. "They love you deeply, probably more than I ever did. I just want to make sure that you never keep them from me again." "I'm sorry," Laura repeated, her eyes filled with regret. "That's all I can say. I truly am sorry for everything I've done." "There's one thing I need to understand," I said. "Why did you get involved with that creep in the first place?" "Don't you think I've asked myself that question 1,000 times?" Laura responded, her frustration evident. "I don't have a clear answer. He worked on me carefully over a long period. He knew exactly what he was doing. When he realized the girls weren't his, he was quick to use it against me. He saw that they looked so much like you. I had private detectives following you," Laura continued. "They were convinced you had some of Michael's money and thought you might use it to start your own business if you lost your job. When you went to Southampton and met Ethan Smith, they were furious. Then, when the company's biggest contracts, including Smith's, were cancelled, they were shocked. They didn't expect the bank to seize their assets, and then the police came," Laura said, a bitter edge to her voice. "James had been charging almost everything to the company. We lost everything, our house, our car. James and Mark were arrested for misusing company funds." "Were you involved in that?" Laura asked, her eyes searching mine. "No, Laura," I said firmly. "The law took its course without my interference. But James and Mark were drawing enormous salaries. They blew through the money on the stock market and in clubs. James had a penchant for gambling. By the time they tried to get you out of the company, they had spent almost everything." "So you still haven't explained why you got mixed up with that man?" I pressed. "I was angry," Laura admitted, her voice breaking. "James was incredibly manipulative. He deceived me in ways I never thought possible. Every time you were away, James would make these little comments," Laura confessed, her eyes clouded with regret. "He'd let me overhear things that made it seem like you were seeing other women. It's hard to explain, but I'd hear him talking to Mark about expenses for nightclubs and other things. He implied you had girlfriends all over the place, in New York, Rome, anywhere you traveled. They convinced me you were meeting up with women during your trips. If you suspected I was cheating, why didn't you confront me? I asked, trying to understand because I couldn't bring myself to believe it, Laura said, her voice trembling. If I had confronted you and you admitted it was true, I didn't know if I could handle it. I wasn't as strong as you. I think I would have stayed and tried to make things work, even if it meant being miserable. Over time, my doubts grew. Then, when the play came up, you know how much I wanted you to take me to it. James overheard you say you were going to New York. He saw me upset, so he comforted me. He even drove me home to get your bag and then to the airport. We didn't go back to work. Instead, he took me to the river at Sunnydale and we talked all afternoon. He took me to dinner and then to the play. I had too much to drink that night. I know it's no excuse, but I ended up sleeping with him. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Is there something you want me to say? I'm not looking for forgiveness, Laura said quietly. I just needed you to understand. James set everything up. If you hadn't come home that day, they had planned to send you photos of us together anonymously. I knew it was wrong to sleep with James, and he wasn't very good at it, just selfish. But that night, he made me feel better, and I was feeling so low, thinking you were off with someone else. I don't need to hear about your regrets with him, I said firmly. It's not relevant now, I'm sorry, Laura said. James was bad at almost everything except hurting me. He got quite good at that toward the end. When you found us together, I was furious, but not just at you. I felt like you had set me up. Sophia told me you wouldn't be home until Sunday, and I was sure she was your girlfriend. I was angry with you for catching me. But now I see it was more about my anger and guilt. I was planning to tell you about the twins the day we signed the divorce papers, Laura admitted. I wanted to tell you before you signed so it wouldn't seem like I was using them to make you change your mind. I wanted you to have a choice. But you were still angry, and I should have realized then that you weren't cheating. If you had been, you wouldn't have been so upset by my actions. Instead, you called me terrible names, and I lost my temper. Stop apologizing, I said, trying to stay calm. What's done is done. Nothing will change the past. Will I ever forgive you? It's a tough question. I might eventually, but I'll never forget. What matters now are the girls. I'll be polite to you for their sake. You're their mother, and I'll be their loving father. Just don't bring any boyfriends around. There won't be any boyfriends, Laura promised. Laura eventually recovered and lived in a small house on the estate with the girls until they went to college. She passed away from cancer a few years later. I believe the overdose had left lasting damage that contributed to her illness. Charlotte and I ended up getting married. Do I love her? It's different from how I loved Laura. Charlotte and I are more like soulmates. We care for each other deeply and enjoy our time together. I guess it's love, but it's not the same as what I had with Laura. The twins are now grown, married, and have children of their own. Charlotte, who is known as Grandma, often feels too young for the role. Am I happy now? It's a mix of yes and no. I wish I could have spent my life with the woman I loved. All I can do now is place flowers on her grave every Sunday. Charlotte waits at the cemetery gate while I do that. Life moves on.